Right, so thank you all for coming. My name is Max Johnstone. I'm the senior planner with the Mid-Coast Council of Governments. Tonight, we're going to be talking about the basics of the municipal tax increment financing program. This is part of our series of technical assistance workshops. So let's just get started. Oops, sorry about that. What is it? What is a municipal tax increment financing program, or is what I'm going to be calling throughout this whole time a TIF? It's not what your kid is going to be doing when they're upset with their Christmas presents this year. No, it is instead the economic tool that has been used for over 7 decades at this point. Sorry about that. I'll have that later. It's an economic tool that's been used in the United States for almost over 70 years. And here in the state of Maine, it's been used since 1985 to help with the redevelopments and the reuse of a lot of properties in communities. In Maine, the first one was over in Saco to help with redeveloping their unused mill on Saco Island. This is something that is able to be created by any municipality, and for anyone who's an unorganized territory, your county commissioners can be the legislative body to enact it. Now, this is a tool that allows communities to shelter up to 100% of any tax revenue that can be used to create new infrastructure and to help with redevelopment projects. And that is some tax revenue that can use over a 30-year period. And before anyone wants to jump out of their seats and start putting their entire community into it, there are limitations to this. First of all, you can only have up to 2% of a total land area in a TIF district, as well as 2% of that total value of your community. So if your community is worth $100,000 in total, and there's 100 acres, I know I'm lowballing it, then you may only have a single TIF district that only has $2,000 worth of value of your whole community in there, and only 2 acres. But obviously, we're talking about bigger communities, so it's a lot more than you actually would anticipate. Now, you may also have multiple TIF districts, but you will only be limited to 5% of total land and value at any time. So you may have hundreds, if not thousands, of TIF districts, but when combined, it can only be 5% of the total land and value area. So there are 3 commonly known types of TIF districts. Tonight, we're mostly going to be talking about the economic TIF. There is also the housing TIF. This is where you would cooperate with the Maine State Housing Authority to obviously create some more housing units in your community. There is also a downtown TIF. This is a very unique program that anyone who does have a downtown, this is a highly encouraged one to pursue. You would need a downtown master plan to have this, and the downtown master plan must be approved by your legislative body. Now, how much actually goes into these programs? Well, it depends where you start. The 2 most common things you're going to have in your TIF district is either an undeveloped parcel, like that green area you see on the top part, or a blighted or brownfield site like you see on the bottom left there. These are parcels that have very little value at the time you're looking at it, mostly just going to be based on the land. Later on, and what your TIF is going to actually generate will depend what's actually built on there. On the right, we're looking at apartment units, but these could be offices, they could be a new commercial park. Even if someone just built a single house on there, that is still going to be value added to your TIF district. Well, let's look at the numbers. So let's say you took that undeveloped parcel or brownfield site, and it's worth $100,000 by the time you're actually approving your TIF district. That would be what's called the original assessed value. No matter how much this property is going to go up in value, that $100,000 is going to be very important. Now, let's say 1 year after you approve the TIF, your tax assessor's agent suspiciously says, well, it's now worth $1 million. That $900,000 difference is now considered capture assessed value. And that is the value that's going to contribute to your TIF district. And that $900,000 will remain sheltered from the state and county valuations. Now, what do I mean by sheltered? Usually, whenever you're getting any tax revenue, it's going to go into one of 4 buckets or categories. There's the municipality, So your administrative fees, public works, emergency services, things of that nature. Then there is what you get for the municipal revenue sharing program. There's the amount that goes to the schools, and there are the county taxes. When we're talking about new developments, most municipalities will lose at least 50% of the new development value in taxes to the revenue sharing, school system, and the county taxes. But if you have a TIF district, then you get to keep 100% of that new value that's going to be created from those parcels. It's all in the state municipality, and it doesn't impact revenue sharing, school system, and the county. I'll get to that in just a moment. Because many of you are like me, you probably need to see a visual, you need to see a chart. So, and sorry for the people I might be obstructing the view from. So the chart on our left, you see what happens for our $1 million example. And I should stress that these are all examples we're talking about tonight. This isn't based on any community. This is just our $1 million example with a $15 mill rate. So if the property became $1 million, what would happen with a $15 mill rate is about half of it, or 8,000 in this case, would be going off to the school district. That's because you would have been losing that's because when the school is calculating the state is calculating how much your school district gets in subsidies, they're going to see that your community is now worth $1 more million. So you don't need as much in school subsidies, but something has to pay for that. Well, that's where this 8,000 is going to come in. It's going to help replenish that loss in subsidies. Same thing with the small little green sliver you see here on the municipal revenue sharing. 575, it's not going to be that much of an impact, but still, that's a revenue source you don't get as much of anymore because you're suddenly $1 million worth more in value. And then your county taxes will go up. And it's that new development that's likely to be paying that enhanced contribution. Leaving you about, in this example, about 32%, or about $4,675 for this $15,000 paycheck, or tax revenue that you're going to get for the town. Now, if you have a TIF, we get to the right chart, the one with this big yellow, almost full circle. That is what you get to keep. That is this $900,000 captured assessed value we were talking about. And that $13,500 goes towards your TIF program. That's tax revenue that goes towards the projects we will be talking about in there. And you may be saying, well, why is there still some money going to the school, municipal revenue sharing, and all these other buckets? Well, that's because that $100,000 original assessed value I mentioned earlier is still in play. That's still going to contribute to your general fund. When you place a parcel into the TIF district, whatever that original assessed value will always contribute that same amount to the general fund. Doesn't matter how much higher that parcel will go in value. As far as the state and the county is concerned, that parcel will always be $100,000 in this example for at least the 30 years of this life cycle. Meanwhile, the higher it goes, the more that goes into your TIF fund. So this will be our first quick Q&A break. We're going to be talking about projects in just a second, but so far, are there any questions people have about the history behind it or the revenue that's generated from it? And if you're on Zoom, I can quickly.
Can you go back to the old slide?
The old slide?
Yeah, that one.
This one, okay.
Just leave it up on break so I can look at it.
Yeah,
a little more close. Thank you.
Sure. And just a reminder, these slides will be available along with any documents that I'm going to be talking about later. As long as I have people's email addresses in the chat or here in person, there's a sign-in sheet that if you can sign that, I can send you emails to that as well. But let me quickly. Yes.
Yeah, I'll ask, in some cases, the school is kind of synonymous with the town. Is that a discretionary thing where you just don't count it in the school financing part, or is it mandatory? Does that make sense?
I think I know what you mean. I'm
Well, I
talking,
just think there's a political price to be paid if I were to exclude the school from some revenue source and
that's,
put that tax on other people.
so that's actually a commonly believed thing, that by creating a TIF district, you're taking money away from the school. When what actually is changing is just how the school's getting that same amount of money. So in this chart that we have here, where without a TIF, 8,000 goes to the school, but with the TIF, only 800 goes to the school. We have a $7,200 difference. The school still gets that $7,200 difference from the state, because the state still believes that this parcel we're talking about is only $100,000. The school will still get $8,000 while this parcel goes up in value. It's just gonna get the money from state subsidies rather than from the town itself, if that makes sense.
That doesn't matter if you're a minimally receiving town versus a town that receives significant state aid for education.
No, I mean, again, I'm only talking about this example that I have right here. I'd have to work with your tax assessor's agent to see how much from your taxes do go to this, do make up any loss in school subsidies. I'd have to look at those numbers myself and put together a formula for you. But,
Okay.
you know, this is an example of 32% staying with the town and just over half of this 15,000 going to replenish losses in school subsidies. It could be half, could be 60%. Regardless, either the state is going to give those subsidies to your school or you have to replenish it because of this increase in value. But the school still gets the same amount of money.
Max, this might be a dumb question, but the municipal revenue, that's the municipal revenue sharing?
Yes.
Okay.
And don't worry about any questions you ask tonight. We're talking about the basics of TIF. I'm expecting people to ask questions like this or questions like what Jim just mentioned a minute ago. Anything related to a TIF, it's all out there. I want to talk about it a lot more with people.
So I have a question.
Yes.
So is this basically revolving around school financing? I mean, because in your example, you're talking about schools getting money, or what, I mean, where else would the money be applied of in the school?
So I'm talking about how towns already have to allocate certain funds from their revenue sources. Are you talking about the school budget itself, or are you talking about?
Well, you keep using the school as an example.
Well, that's because the school is one of three examples. As I say, you're not gonna get as much from the state to pay for the school subsidies anymore. The town would have to replenish that. But there's also how much you get from the state for on the municipal revenue sharing program. The higher in value your community is going to be, you're not gonna get as much in the municipal revenue sharing program anymore. So that new development's gonna have to chip in to pay it off. Same thing with county taxes. If we're in Warren tonight, if Warren goes up significantly, well, Knox County is gonna look at that and say, well, Warren can now pay Warren County taxes. And it's gonna be that new development that's chipping in to pay those higher county taxes. Does that make sense, or?
Yeah, yes. This is,
I don't mean to be picking on the school.
no, pick on it, go ahead. Well, it's the same.
I think the schools do a good job picking on themselves.
Okay, I wasn't gonna say anything, people.
Max, question, where do you get the 68%? I'm sorry, but how did you?
Yeah, no worries. So typically, myself or any consultant you'll have that's going to put these forms together, they usually will have some different types of formulas for how this is all calculated. I always base mine on The population of the community, what the current value is at, the state has you valued at. The average county taxes for the last 5 years. And for the school, sometimes it's going to be the student population as well, including loss in students over time. This one is not really going to be a solid concrete answer because, again, I don't have a community I'm basing this on. This is me just saying a town of 1,000 with this stagnant county tax price. It's, as I say, if anyone wants actual hard numbers for your community, that's something that I would probably have to do personally on that, because there's usually a method to my madness when it comes to this, but this is unfortunately just going to be examples for tonight.
Right.
Yeah. Sorry if that didn't answer your question fully, but.
Well, I guess it does. I mean, so basically, that's all part of the formula in calculating this, but there is a percentage that has some sort of basis that comes into play when we calculate a TIF.
Yeah, I think,
Okay.
I think Elliott, Maine, for example, if anyone wants to Google this or Bing it or whatever search engine people use. Elliott, Maine does have, I think, in their TIF program, some formulas that I typically would be using as well. But they explain how they came to their different values of this. My boss and I, we both have different ways of calculating these different tax shifts. The thing is, you're never going to know exactly how much this tax shift is going to be. Bless you. That was a big one. You're never going to know exactly how much this tax shift is going to be until that first year of the revenue coming in. That's when you're actually going to see how much actually gets captured in this TIF. But speak with your tax assessor's agent and see what the split already is, and that's roughly what you might be looking at already.
So if I'm understanding TIF correctly, it's you're basically taking evaluation and tax base or tax cost, shifting it from the town and putting it onto a state.
Well, yes and no, because it's either you losing all that tax revenue to the state, or you get to invest the money that's already in your community back into your community. It's gonna have to be paid at some point. And again, this is a program that only really lasts for 30 years. Once this 30-year program is over, then the state now looks at what the state can now include the capture assessed value. I mean, we have it at 900,000 right now. If your community created TIF, it went up to $1 million, and you decide, this isn't for us. Let's put it back into the regular program. Then the state looks at it and says, oh, it's now $1 million parcel. The town's picking up the tab for everything else at this point, or for the difference. Are there any other questions before we move on to projects? Hearing none. I actually can, there we go. So. You have the TIF fund together. The tax revenue starting to come in, and you think, great, this can go to all these great projects now. Well, there's a limit. First of all, the state of Maine legislature does outline the eligible projects that this can be used for. I do have the link on here, and unfortunately, I'm not going to have anything to really show everyone tonight because it's a very long list. But it does break down into 5 distinct categories. And again, I'll send this out after the meeting to anyone who provides me their email. But there's 5 distinct categories. There is projects that occur within a TIF district itself. There are projects that are outside of the TIF district. However, it's used to help support said district. There are projects that are used for general development within your community. There's construction and improving public buildings that are located in a downtown TIF. As I mentioned earlier, we're focusing on the economic TIF, so we're not really focusing on the 4th item tonight. And then the 5th item is a rather new one. but costs associated with the development of affordable housing or services to address homelessness. While the state does outline the different projects that you can use this for, any town that creates a TIF program must also have the residents approve what those projects would be ahead of time. So you kind of have to include in your program, well, I want the TIF money to go towards sidewalk extension or a utility extension. Well, that's great. That's something that helps some economic development, but if it's not something your town approved ahead of time when you were creating this TIF program, then that's something you can't do just yet. You have to have a town vote to approve that project prior to spending the money on this project. Now, you're probably thinking, well, we have to get the state's approval for this. We have to have the town residents approve all this stuff. You know, it sounds like this is a lot of work, and you know, maybe we don't have that many projects to come. Well, it's actually a pretty extensive list. Just some examples for projects that are associated with TIF district. There is the ability to pay for administrative services associated with TIF district. So if you have a town staff member or a third-party consultant that is working on your TIF district, implementing your TIF district, even when your tax assessor's agent has to deal with any value associated with that TIF district, all of that are items that you can pay using these tax revenues. It can also be used for the acquisition of parcels, demolition of structures, and the construction of any buildings. Just one town over in Waldeboro, they use their TIF district to purchase a downtown parking lot. Something that was always used for private use, but once it was available on the market and there was the threat of it being developed into something else, the town used the TIF district to purchase the parcel, and now it's preserving downtown parking lot. But some towns can also use this for demolition of slum and blight buildings or constructing on a brownfield site. And then outside of the TIF district, outside of the TIF parcels, there's a sewer pump station upgrades and public safety improvements. This could be fixing the old culvert so that your emergency vehicles can access these TIF parcels that are identified. It can be used to purchase the fire truck itself if you wanted to, because that's going to help preserve the value of those TIF districts. And then just some general economic projects, trail systems, costs associated with childcare and adult care, broadband, scholarships for students so that they can go into workforce training to benefit local jobs in your area. And then projects supporting affordable housing, expanding utilities to assist with the affordable housing. And if there's a local group that's specialized in assisting the reduction of homelessness, that is also an eligible expense. And this is where, whenever we talk about TIFs, I always get people saying, well, don't you have to give the money back to the developers? Don't you have to give a certain amount or give the whole thing back to the people who are going to make these improvements? You can if you want to. I'm not stopping you. But that's commonly known as a credit enhancement agreement, or that's what it's known here in the state of Maine, credit enhancement agreement, where the town has, as the name implies, an agreement with this developer to give a percentage of the revenue from those TIF funds back to that developer. Now, credit enhancement, like the TIF projects we mentioned earlier, must be outlined as an intended use in the proposed TIF program and approved through a town meeting. So this is not something that can be snuck in under the radar. This is something that you have to have the residents aware about when they're voting on it. And in the state of Maine, a municipality may establish this TIF program without giving any of the revenue back to the developer. That was something that we were seeing here in Warren just a couple of weeks ago, where the solar developer came before the select board and said, we need some of this revenue to come back to us. Would you please consider recommending this and putting it on the ballot? The town doesn't have to do this if the town does not want to. And that was the recommendation made by the TIF committee here in the town of Warren. You know, it's something that we think can be more beneficial if the town keeps the full revenue and doesn't send it right back to the developer. Now, with all that being said, I'm not saying that a credit enhancement is terrible. There are benefits to it. If you can come to an agreement that encourages employment, which is either creating or retaining jobs, swapping a slum and blight location or a brownfield site for a long-term benefit to the community. Earlier, we were seeing the pictures of just this decrepit old area with a concrete slab and maybe some housings on it. And maybe that's something your town's looking for. That's a potential use and maybe a great use of the credit enhancement if your town agrees with that. Or any benefits that your community would see outside of traditional tax income. Just because a developer comes to you and says, oh, you know, if you do this, you'll still get 50% of the revenue. Well, that's just a regular tip. And as we established, you can keep 100% if you want. So what could you get beyond that? Some towns end up getting stipends for the residents. Some will get reduced electric rates, depending on the developer. So there are other beneficial things, but it has to be something you outline in this credit enhancement that your residents or your town council would have to approve. It's whoever your legislative body is. They must approve this credit enhancement, which again, and I will stress it one more time, you do not have to do a credit enhancement to have a TIF. You can have a TIF without a credit enhancement. Another quick Q&A break. So we've gone over projects, and we're going to be talking about how to actually create a TIF for those of you who are interested. But are there any questions so far? Whether it's on the revenue, the projects, anything so far? It's either a good sign or a bad sign when I'm not getting any questions. All right, we'll keep going then. So, you haven't run away yet, so maybe you're still interested in creating one. So where do you start? Well, first see what your town has for resources. Does your town already have a TIF in place by chance? Some towns approved TIFs ages ago, but apparently forgot that they had it in place. So there's probably a TIF that's accumulating some resources already. And you just need someone to help implement what it was intended for. So learn about what that TIF was used for. And if it's met its goal. If it hasn't, see how you can adapt it to meet its goals. But maybe you don't have a TIF, so look into the other strategic documents that your town has approved. Because most towns will approve something, put it on the shelf. But those are very interesting plans that do have nuggets of knowledge that you should keep in mind. So your comprehensive plans, downtown master plans, if you have them, even capital improvement strategies, anything that just outlines what your town wants to do in the next 5 to 10 years, any big capital improvement projects that could use these funds. That's what you're looking for. That's what you have to address. If your town does not have an economic committee or group that's dedicated to these types of pieces of research, create an ad hoc committee of residents so that they can learn more about this program and see if there is interest in the community based on the perspective of some average residents. And talk with your tax assessor's agent, your code enforcement officer, planning department, just to see if there's going to be some large development or change in value in the coming 1 to 2 years. This does include revaluations and the selling of town-owned property. If yes, find out when, because that is going to be important for deadlines that you'll have to face later on. Really, it boils down to 2 questions you have to ask yourself. 1, do I see my community seeing a huge change in value anytime in the next 2 years? Could be the revaluations. A lot of towns are going through this right now. But here in the town of Warren, it was a solar farm, 1 parcel, 500 to 600 acres or so. That is going to create millions and millions of dollars in significant change. If I'm correct, it's a fifth of what the town's currently valued at. So something like that. 1 parcel is gonna have 1/5 of the value increase in just 1 or 2 years. That's a pretty big significant change that you might want to see if it's worth putting into a TIF district. So if there is a significant change, then ask your second question. What can this be used on? Is this something that the town will actually use? Again, we'll use Warren. There's fire trucks, the fire station, whether it's an addition or maybe a new one, we're talking 30 years as well. Scholarship programs for students to learn about trades so that they can come back to this area and address the huge gap that's needed in this area. Culverts have gotten a lot more expensive. This is something that can help pay for that if towns need it. So those are the two questions you got to ask yourself and ask your community. Is there going to be a change in value, a significant size? And if we go forward with this, is this something we actually could use? Now, the requirements itself to actually create a TIF district. I'm going to work backwards on this timeline. Municipalities will have until March 31st of any given year to have a state-approved proposal. That means you have to get this approved by the Maine Department of Economic and Community Development by March 31st of that calendar year. After that date, the original assessed value will be reset to whatever the tax assessor's agent has it at of April 1st of that same calendar year. So just an example, we have our $100,000 example we've been talking about this whole time. If it was $100,000 as of April 1st, 2023, you can create a TIF district that dates back to April 1st, 2023, and have that $100,000 original assessed value. Even if this was approved by the state by March 31st of 2024, you can still have that $100,000 original value. But if you waited until April 1st of 2024, and the value had gone up to this $1 million, well, now the original assessed value will be $1 million, and you can't come back from that. It is highly recommended that if you do want to create this, that you try and work with the state to submit something at least 2 months prior to March 31st, or earlier. The sooner the better, really. Because if you send something to the state and they have notes for you, then it's not a state-approved project, and you don't want to run out the clock on that. I always like the 2-month window because it gives the state plenty of time, it gives the town plenty of time to respond. So I always like having that little window for myself. To actually get it to the state for approval, municipalities must have a plan approved by the legislative body. For most of you listening tonight, I'm going to guess that that's your town meeting. However, if your charter dictates otherwise, it could be the town council or select board, but that depends on what each of your communities has it written as. And to actually get it approved by the legislative body, the TIF must have had at least one public hearing that was held with at least 10 days public notice in a regularly circulated newspaper of the area. And the state does have specific language that it's looking for. Now, you could have this public hearing the day of the town meeting itself or the town council. As long as you had it in the newspaper 10 days before that hearing itself, that's all that matters. Because the state is going to look for the minutes of that hearing, they're going to look at the ad of that hearing, and for the vote itself, they're going to look for the actual results of that vote to show that it was approved. Now, it passed. It passed tonight. I don't know how on earth any of you could have done it where we just started talking about this and you suddenly had a TIF pass, but it passed. Don't stop. Even though it's exhilarating that it passed your local community, it's still not done because you still need, as I mentioned earlier, approval from the Maine Department of Economic and Community Development to actually sign off on this program. As stated earlier, if you had the town approve it, but you didn't get it in by March 31st, the state doesn't really have to follow what you approved. They can say, well, you didn't do it until this date, so unfortunately we can't allow this type of thing to keep going forward. Now, each year, the funds still have to be allocated into the different projects for your community. And there's 2 different funds for that. There's the project cost account. These are the projects that you aim to complete that year. So, you know, if this is a quick engineering study, that's something that will probably be a project cost. But if there is a project that you intend to use more of the TIF account, you are still also going to be required to go back to the legislative body to get approval for that. So using our $13,500 example, you have the first year's worth of revenue from it, $13,500, and you say, well, we have this big project that's going to cost $100,000. You have to have another municipal vote to say, we want to take out a loan or go into municipal debt, and it's going to be paid for using the TIF account. You have to go through the municipal vote again, just like you would with any incurring of this debt. That is known as the sinking fund. And remember these terms, because we're going to talk about them later with some changes the state has given us in just a bit. And also keep in mind that any amendments you make to this TIF, that's including new parcels, taking out some parcels that you don't think are beneficial. Same thing with projects. If you want to include new projects, take out some projects. Any changes you are making to this TIF district will always require the same approval process as as you did to create it in the first place. Same public hearing notice, same requirements to get the town to approve it. Still has to get the Maine DECD to approve it. They're the same requirements just to amend the TIF. So keep that in mind. And then we got some best practices. As stated earlier, don't wait until the last minute. There was one town that I witnessed very amazingly. They got approved in March, and they were really chomping at the bit, trying to rush the state to get this approved on March 30th. They passed it. I was amazed, but it's not the best idea, especially if the state's overwhelmed with some projects. If you have a quote unquote public draft of the municipal TIF application, you can still send it to the Maine DECD ahead of time for review. Obviously, note that it is a draft, that it is still going to public for a vote. But if they are not overwhelmed with work, they will be able to look at your public document and make notes so that if you have this last minute issue that I'm talking about, they can at least tell you ahead of time, well, if you change the wording here, here, and here, you don't have any problems. That's kind of helpful for that last minute ditch effort. It's not required, but is a very, very helpful tool, especially if it's first time and it's your last minute application. Another big suggestion I have is the creation of a non-select board committee to oversee the TIF. While some may say, well, you're just creating another committee. It's a very important group that adds this additional perspective that really gives you some other residential aspects about it. And I think it also helps take a big load off of the select board's agendas most of the time, because this is a lot of research you have to go into. I mean, look at us right now. I'm 40 minutes in. You should have seen my other specific ones to the communities. It takes a little bit longer. And the other big reason I support these types of groups is because community engagement is a make or break for these different TIF proposals. I mean, I'm doing this workshop tonight because, and we've heard some questions where people assumed, well, TIF does this or TIF does that. If you have those same questions, there's a very good chance there's a lot of people out there who have the same assumptions, and having that public outreach is key to dispelling those items. Honestly, we could end tonight where all of you will tell me you're never going to do a TIF because even though this is what it is, it's just not for your community. I'm fine with that. The reason I love these TIF programs so much is because they are a community focused, controlled item. I like it when a town can decide what it does with the tax revenue themselves. I like it when a town will get that tax revenue and they can put it to a project that they decided themselves, rather than looking at it and then, as my example showed earlier, giving 68% of it to all these other items before the town had a say in the matter. That's my personal perspective. But if your town says, we don't need a TIF, we understand what it is, but we just don't need it, I'm fine with that. That's your decision. And that's why community engagement is key for these TIF proposals. The other two items is that you don't need an attorney to put together a draft proposal. The Maine Department of Economic and Community Development has actually put together a very streamlined application that makes this a lot easier. You do not need an attorney. You can still get an attorney if you want, but it's not required. I can do it. Depending on who you ask, your regional council might be able to do it. Shoot, you could do it yourselves if you want to. There's no requirement on who's actually filling these out. But some people think you have to get an attorney, and that adds thousands of dollars onto something that shouldn't really cost you more than a couple hundred, maybe. All right. Last slide before we get into the final Q&A, and you don't want to leave for this one. These are the most recent legislative changes that have happened in just this year. As I said, the project list always changes. The state loves to add in some projects that they believe are going to add some economic growth to the state. So we have LD 286. This allows the community to use 50%. I'm sorry, let me start there. 50% of capital costs related to a municipal central administrative office may use TIF funding, as long as it does not exceed 15% of that captured invested value. So if your central office needs to be rearranged so that your code enforcement officer, your planning department, anyone can have easier access to get some building permits, apply for any business related items. Those are eligible uses of your TIF districts. Fixing some of the heating and air system, there's a heat pump here, getting that so that your town office can stay open during extreme weather events, so that people can get their permits, no issues. That's an eligible use, as long as it's no more than 50% of those capital costs, and they're still associated with economic developments. It always has to tie to economic development in some way. So if it's $100,000 cost, 50,000 can be covered by the TIF. If you can pass that straight face test of economic development. I've talked a lot, what can I say? The second one, it allows LD 1644. TIF funds may still be used after your TIF life cycle ends. So TIFs may only last for up to 30 years. For most cases, we're going to get into that in a minute. So at the end of the 30-year period, there's always been this bit of, well, we still have all this money left in the TIF account. We have to spend it all immediately, or we have to put it back into the general fund. With this change, there's two options. If your town incurred any municipal debt that's being paid off by the TIF district, then the TIF account can still exist, and what's remaining can go into the sinking fund and stay in the sinking fund as long as you're still paying off that debt. Now, this doesn't mean you get to keep that captured value. That goes back into the original value that we talked about. That $1 million at the end of 30 years becomes $1 million. But if you kept $500,000 in your TIF account up to the 30th year, and you still have a project that is in the works and you need to take out a loan for that, that $500,000 doesn't go back to the general fund. It's paying off this project for as long as that debt is there. Could be 5 years, could be 10 years. And then you can also, if you don't have a big project like that, you can also put projects, you can also use the remaining funds to go into these project costs, these smaller projects that we just talked about. As long as you have some projects left, you can put the remaining TIF funds into this account for up to 3 years to pay for these smaller projects. At the end of that third year, any funds that are left in your TIF account do go back into the general fund. And they are then incurred by the same values and accounts that we were talking about earlier. Whatever's left, a piece of it will go to the municipal budget. A piece of it's going to go towards to addressing any losses in school subsidies, any losses in municipal revenue sharing, and the increase in county taxes. That's what happens to that at the end of those 3 years. But before this was created, at the end of the 30th year, that's when the town had to put the money back into the general fund. So you get an extra 3 years to spend this remaining funds. Now, LD 1739. This is the biggest game changer I want to point out to any town that is listening, especially if you are talking about housing in the community. if at least 75% of TIF funds are used for housing or transit-oriented projects within the first 10 years, that district may be extended for an additional 20 years. So most TIF districts only have a 30-year life cycle at max. If the first 10 years are dedicated to housing or transit-oriented projects, your TIF life cycle ends up being now 50 years. That was just passed this year. Yeah, I'm seeing that in the back. Obviously, the state wanted to pass this to try and encourage more affordable housing projects. You do not have to do this if you do not want to, but you get a bonus 10 years. You get 10 years, as long as you dedicate 10 years for housing projects or public transportation related projects. You get an additional 10 years for whatever you want. It could be housing. It could be economic development. As long as it's an eligible project, you get that bonus 10 years.
10 or 20 bonus.
It's 20 total, but you have to have the first 10 years dedicated to housing, and then the life cycle ends at the 50th year. So first 10 are for housing, you have 40 left. And now I'm going back and forth. You have 50-year life cycle of a TIF. That's the key thing I want to get out there. So pass a TIF today in, well, next year, 2024. Dedicate 2024 to 2034 to housing or transit properties, or just 75% of that TIF funding to those projects. The other 25%, whatever else you want. And then from 2034 to 2074, yeah, I got that number right. All right, I got the thumbs up from the math man back there, so I'm good. 2074, you can have a TIF in place. That's something I really want to make sure everyone remembers tonight, especially if you're looking for housing in your community. That's a big, big game changer. So I know I said the last one was the last one, but this is actually the last one. This is just contact information. Tina Mullins, she's the development program officer up at the Maine Department of Economic Development. She's the one who will be reviewing your TIF proposal. She's very knowledgeable. She'll give you precise answers, so give her precise questions. Matthew Eddy is the executive director of the Mid-Coast Council of Governments. He's very knowledgeable on this topic. He's done a lot for Biddeford and Brunswick. And very recently, I think he did an amendment for Bowdenham, and he actually got one he also helped get one passed up in Union, just a little bit north of here, for the Thompson Community Center redevelopment efforts. And then on the bottom of the list, we have myself, Maxwell Johnstone, the senior planner. I don't have as much experience in it, but I have passed TIFs in the past. I have passed amendments, and I'm here tonight to answer any other questions you may have. And with that said, are there any final questions?
So Max, this is Alan Kratz.
Yes.
Max? Hi, I'm Alan Kratz, and I'm zooming in on behalf of Blue Hill Peninsula tomorrow. This is 9 towns who meet monthly via Zoom to talk about advancing climate resilience. So my question is really, and I'm really glad to see, I work with people from the town of Surrey and also Deer Isle. Jim and all of our Surrey colleagues are here. My question is, if you could go back to slide 10, where you talk about eligible projects. You mentioned a few things that I think do relate to funding and financing climate change. You mentioned culverts. That's obviously top of mind in many towns this week, again.
Right.
Are there other, and I want to tie this to your penultimate slide too, where you're talking about future changes to the TIF program that the legislature might consider. Is there going to be an increased specific emphasis on projects that will advance climate resilience, mitigation, adaptation? What's your view on that? And can you elaborate on, have there been good examples of towns that have used TIF for addressing climate change?
Very good question. So to answer your question, and it's not on here, but another project that was recently allowed was improving fishery and wildlife habitats associated with obviously the local economy. People love coming up to Maine because it's the way life should be. A lot of natural habitats. Some people go to a lot of towns just to observe the natural beauty. And whether it's here in Warren along the St. George River, or one town over in Waldoboro along the Madomic River, or Damashquad with the Pemaquid River, or I could talk about all these different rivers. There's working waterfronts as well. You can use the TIF money to help restore and preserve those working waterfronts, as well as the natural habitats, since they are used in the local economy. Same thing with trails. I mean, trails weren't something that TIF could be used for quite some time ago, but it is something that helps generate the tourism industry. And I know it seems like I'm always going back to the economic focus on it, but as long as you tie it to the economy, and in your case, you're talking about community resiliency, that is something that can tie into it, as long as you can make that connection. I mentioned culverts just a minute ago, or throughout this presentation. If a culvert's going to be washed out, that's a huge impact because of climate resilience. And who needs to go over the culvert to access the other parts of your community? Emergency services, and they have to go to help preserve how your community currently is set up. So whether the state is going to create new ones that are specifically focused on climate resiliency, I unfortunately can't give you a solid answer on that. They could. That does take the efforts of a legislative amendment, kind of like the LDs we just talked about a minute ago. Those were three things I honestly didn't imagine were going to happen, but they happened. So I think this, as you pointed out, with recent events, the state may be encouraged to say, hey, look, if we don't have this go towards climate mitigation items, this severely hurts the state of Maine. We need to have the TIF funds accessible to this. And that would have to take legislative action on it. Does that answer your question?
It does. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Max?
Yeah,
Jim Murphy, assessor's agent for the town of Warren. If per chance we passed a TIF or a town passed a TIF that had X, Y, and Z things allowed in it, I would assume that once that was approved at state planning, that would be a contract with the town. If the legislature then took away item Z, that would not affect the town. That makes sense to you?
right. So for those who didn't hear, the question was if the town and the state agreed on certain eligible projects using TIF funds, and then 1 year later, the state says, well, no, those projects aren't eligible uses anymore. The town and the state already have the contract. Are those still eligible uses? Yes, the state doesn't really take away projects from their list. They might be a bit more tight on the language, but I'll put it like this, the state's going to be in for a very nasty lawsuit if they decide to say, oh, well, we're no longer going to have this fund sewer extensions anymore, because a lot of towns pass these with the belief and guarantee from the state that it could be used for sewer extensions, or it could be used for broadband or childcare or any of these other things that I'm just listing tonight. So you do have that guarantee from the state. George, I see your hand up.
Yeah, thank you. Presentation. Two questions. One, on the last slide where you mentioned the extension for housing, is it any housing at all, or is it just affordable housing that justifies the 20-year extension?
Great question. It is meant for affordable housing, and that is defined under the Maine State Housing Authority as well as U.S. Housing and Urban Development. I'm going to look at Dan in case I get it wrong. I believe it's 80% I believe it's for rent, 80% of the area median income. So it's based on what your county numbers are, not Portland or anyone else. And if it's owned, it's 120% of the area median income. I got those numbers.
It's related. And the second question is, if I'm understanding this correctly, because a legitimate use of the funds is for parcel acquisition, this could be used by a town to discount the cost of land assembly to make it available more affordably for the developer. Is that right?
Correct.
Thank you.
Any questions in here before I go back to Zoom? I always like to go back and forth the case. Jim,
Sure. Let me just pose a situation, and because we had it in Deer Isle and I wasn't sure how to handle it, I'd offered to help work on a TIF, but the developers opted out of it. And this is, what would you do if a group of 501c3 nonprofit wants to build housing, workforce housing that will not be taxable if it's owned by a nonprofit, I guess? Would there be any point in pursuing a TIF in that case?
so to be clear about what you're talking about, if they were to build on there, the whole property would be tax exempt.
That's
wouldn't
my
be-
understanding.
I believe in that case, it's not worth it at that point, because really a TIF is only, well, I say that. A TIF really is effective if it's going to have an increase in value. So if the property taxes aren't going to, or the property value, and thus the taxes for that property aren't going up, then you don't really gain too much from putting it in the TIF district. Now, with that said, you could still have it in there if there's a benefit for all the other project costs that I just mentioned. Or in case you know that the property is going to change hands and suddenly become back on the tax payroll. I'll use Waldeboro as an example, or even Union. Over in Waldeboro, they had the Friendship Street School. It was owned by the town since the 90s. This past year, it was put back on the private tax roll, went from $0 to $328,000 overnight. So that's a benefit. And then for the Thompson Community Center up in Union, again, it's owned by the town. It's worth nothing right now. And whether that housing all of a sudden adds value to it, that will then be a benefit to the program. But if it's not, the town can still use what revenue it does get from those other parcels to extend the utilities or improve the utilities on there to benefit the rest of the community, kind of like the credit enhancement we talked about just a minute ago. So I know I gave you a long, rambled, complicated answer, but that's unfortunately what I can give. It's not worth it if that's the only parcel, unless you have a way or some guarantee from the interested group to have investments made to it. I know, long, weird answer that I gave there, but it's also an odd situation you gave me. Does that make sense?
Oh, it does. I mean, I came to the same conclusion. I had hoped by offering a TIF I could keep them from making it nonprofit, because ultimately I think the town has an interest, if they're building housing with children, to having some revenue stream to help pay for schools and other things. But they went nonprofit, so we get nothing, I think.
Yeah, again, unfortunately, a lot of these tips are gonna be case by case basis. If this one was something, if this was a group that said, no, we don't wanna deal with any of that, then I can't help that. It's a local decision at that point. All right, one more survey around the room.
I have one question. So when you the town creates the economic development zone. Are those, do they have to be lumped together in an area, or can they be all over the town?
Good question. And that's something I can't believe I forgot to mention. No, land does not, you all right? Yeah. The land does not have to be contiguous. You may have parcels scattered throughout the entire community. You could have one that you could have everything together, but then 20 miles away is just this one little speck of a parcel that magically might be worth $1 million next month. They don't have to be connected. They are anything that you as the community believe will gain in value or grow in value or be developed in due time. So it could be anywhere throughout the community. It doesn't have to be connected. Does that answer your question? I think I saw Aaron's hand up before. Aaron, do you have a question? All right, in case not, Alan from Blue Hill, do you have a question?
I do. Sherry Stanley put a very good question in the chat on this slide in front of us. The word transient after housing, is that transient or transit-oriented development? I used to work for a public transit agency, so I'm really keen on transit-oriented development. So what is the
Public transportation.
okay, so it is a transit-oriented development projects. Okay,
Yeah.
got it. Thank you. Thanks, Sherry, for
Max.
raising the question.
Aaron?
Max, yeah, thank you. My question was, my understanding of a TIF though is you have to lock it in at one point, you have to lock it in for a certain period of time, right? Like, so you
Yes.
create the district, right?
Yep.
But now the way I just heard you, for example, you might have multiple pieces of land that are sitting there that are empty, that are, you know, that have no value essentially, and you're trying to encourage development. But in other words, nothing might happen there for a number of years. And
Yep.
so the 20 years might happen, say that you create that TIF district and it's a 20-year TIF or something, or 30-year TIF, and nothing happens in that 30 years. I mean, hopefully not, but
Right.
so what happens?
So that again goes down to the point I raised earlier, where you want to make sure you talk with your code enforcement officer, tax assessor's agents, planning board, whoever would know about developments going on there, because you're right. If you have this parcel that's begging, almost ideal for development, and you put it into this TIF district to encourage development, and then a couple of years go by and nothing happens, then yeah, you've just lost limited value or limited time on a very valuable piece of property. So, 10 years go by and someone says, well, now I'm going to turn it into an industrial park and make this huge thing of it. Now you only got 20 years on that, or 40 years if you have the affordable housing tip. But that's why I say make sure you know and have a strategy when going into this. That's why I mentioned the reevaluation. Even if the parcel probably isn't going to have a development on it by next year, but a revaluation is going to make that property worth a lot more, well, you could put it in the TIF district. It's a decision that's up to the town. You could have a TIF district that's only one parcel, because that's the one that's going to have the development. Or you could decide to do the full 2% if you wanted to. But that's, again, a decision that's up to the town. But yes, you're right. The town has to lock into a certain period of time. And I forgot to mention this, but I probably should mention it. I say a 30-year life cycle. You can have it as a shortened period. You can have it as 5 years. You could decide to only have the TIF exist for 1 year if you wanted to. The life cycle of the TIF really is up to the town. But does that answer your question, Aaron?
Well, yes, but a little bit. But I just would it be better to just negotiate the TIF as the development occurs? Or, I mean, it sounds like maybe if you know of a reval, then maybe you should plan for the TIF. But I mean, are you suggesting that if you're trying to encourage development on a certain piece of land, then you create the TIF district there? But is that what you're suggesting?
Again, it's always going to be a case-by-case basis. I mentioned the downtown TIFs earlier. If you know a revaluation is going to happen, and your downtown specifically is going to dramatically increase in value, then getting a TIF in place before that would be a pretty good idea to have, because that's going to be a lot being generated for just revaluation. But whether you want to have a TIF that is meant to be a big signal to people throughout the region saying, hey, we got areas that are prime for development, we want you here, that's something that the town can do. But again, that's a risk, as you noted, that's a risk the town now has to take on. I'm not encouraging a town to put all 2% in there unless you think that's the right thing to do.
Okay, Max, could you just go back? I'm sorry, I have another question. I don't mean to
Yeah,
monopolize.
no worries. No worries.
To go back to the downtown TIF,
Well,
could you explain a little bit more about that? So, my understanding is that you had a TIF, just a generic, like a TIF, like the TIFs that I'm used to are the ones that like, okay, you negotiate with like a manufacturer or something like that
Right.
that comes in. And I've heard of the downtown TIF, but I'm used to thinking of it as like a one parcel by parcel negotiation type thing. And now
Right.
when you think of a downtown TIF, you're thinking now like,
Full
multiple
downtown.
land parcels. Yeah. So can you explain that? So I actually, I'm actually kind of interested now. So you're saying that if a reval's coming up, you can actually shelter the reval amount for these people, even if there's no new development, but like the new assessed value?
yes, but keep in mind that regardless of whether a TIF is in place or a TIF is not in place, those property owners are still paying the same amount in taxes regardless of either case. If it's $1 million, it's going to be the $15,000 that I mentioned earlier. Whether that 15,000 or 13,000 and a half goes into the TIF, or that 13,000 and a half goes back into the general funds, they're going to be, those property owners are going to be paying the same amount. But to answer your question on the downtown TIF, so yes, if you have a downtown master plan and you're in Wiscasset, so I would really, really hope Wiscasset does have one because this will be a big thing. So you can create a TIF district. I get on it then when I'm done telling you about all this.
Yes.
So a downtown TIF is very unique. You would create a TIF district based on your master plan. This means you don't have the same restrictions as any other TIF. I mentioned the 2% limit. You don't have that with the downtown TIF. I think Presque Isle recently had one of the largest ones passed in the state of Maine, and that's well beyond 2%. Whatever you have in your downtown master plan as identified in your downtown, as your downtown, those parcels can all be placed in your TIF district. And it doesn't count towards this 2% total land of your community or the value, or even this 5% calculation. This downtown TIF is a TIF that lets you skirt a lot of those limitations. But you are only limited to the projects that are in your downtown master plan. So keep that in mind. And it also can be used for the municipal buildings that I mentioned earlier. So if you have, so your Wiscasset, so if you identify your town office and fire station in Wiscasset's downtown, you can use TIF funds towards that building for any repairs or new construction or anything of the sort. And the other
will make my town manager happy. We're talking about doing some renovations here, so that's good.
Let me add one more. Well, I can add one more joyous bit for why a downtown TIF is great.
Okay.
If you have another TIF district, an economic TIF district,
Okay.
you can have the funds from the economic TIF district also contribute to your downtown TIF.
Okay.
So even if your economic TIF is miles away from your downtown, you can have any tax revenue generated from that TIF revenue, from the economic TIF, and put it right into your downtown. I believe that's what Richmond and Bodenham have done. They had the natural gas pipeline that was going through it back in the early 2000s. They created a TIF to capture all that. Then they created their own downtown TIFs. So all that revenue from those pipelines went straight to their downtowns. So another huge thing for why a downtown TIF is great. And if you have a downtown area or a little village area, put together a master plan. Always great to have a master plan in this case. Does that answer your question?
Yes, I actually have another question, but I'll let someone else ask away.
I'm gonna say, George, I see your hand up. Let's have you ask a question.
So this is related to this timing issue. from what you're describing, it sounds like you could use this TIF in a purely opportunistic way. Hypothetical, a hotel developer buys a parcel in your town, and while they're drawing up the plans, you know that the land will be valued for tax purposes substantially higher once the hotel is built. You can then TIF it and dedicate the benefit to a legitimate use.
Yep, that's exactly what I'm saying. And we're in Warren again, so I'll use Warren as an example. How much is the land that the solar farm is gonna be, how much is that worth now? Like 400?
Oh, no, it's all treatment. Yeah, right now it's the OAB's treatment, so it's 400 an acre times 700.
Oh, wait,
28,000.
wait,
28,000.
28,000? So there's a parcel in Warren that is worth 28,000 according to the tax assessor's agent right now. And the town knows, the planning board's approved it, I think a building permit's gonna happen in the spring or so, that this massive solar farm is gonna be built on there. And that solar farm will probably be worth 74 plus million, tens of millions of dollars, close to 100 million, who knows? Yeah, if you know that there's gonna be that big of a gap and a huge growth in just 1 year, you got until March 31st to pass a TIF, put it in there, and then that new development goes into the TIF. Same thing with your hotel.
Thanks.
Any questions? Yeah, Mike.
Can you have two downtown TIFs, two separate, sort of at different times?
Huh. 2 downtown TIFs. That's interesting.
Each side of the road.
Well, that I'm sure we.
Yeah,
Two different towns, right?
one time, town, yeah.
So. I believe the answer is yes, as long as you don't have them like double, as long as you're not double dipping. As long as you don't have like one parcel that, you know, is the main reason you created the TIF. And then you decided to create the second downtown TIF that also includes that one.
Oh, yeah, no.
Yeah, no, but if you have 2 separate downtown TIFs, they're still following the same master plan. One was created earlier, so it's gonna end sooner. The other one gets to last a little longer. As long as they're still following the same projects, as long as they're still following the same outline as your master plan.
What if you had two separate master plans?
You have an interesting community if you have 2 different downtown master plans.
Lincolnville,
Oh, gosh.
2 different.
Oh, shoot, we're
Downtowns. Yeah. Gardner Stockport, sort of.
I guess there's nothing stopping a municipality from having having two downtowns, having two downtown TIFs, and having two different downtown.
you'd still have,
master plans.
you'd still have to identify the master plan that it's based on.
Yeah, yeah.
So, my colleague Dan over there decided to bring up Lincolnville. I'm gonna have to watch myself because I'm on board with that. If they create 2 different downtowns, then they just downtown A, downtown B, then they still have to follow what that master plan is gonna be. So if the one that's more in Lincolnville says, we're gonna go with downtown A, well, then they're following the outline from downtown A. Whatever projects that downtown master plan A has, the TIF parcels that are in it, property parcels, etc., that's what they're following. But if they decide to create another downtown over here, and that's downtown B, well, they can't say, well, we like our outline, but we want to use the exact same projects from downtown A. No, you're committing fully to downtown B. So you can have multiple downtown TIFs and multiple downtown plans, but you gotta make sure they're tied, they're locked together. Does that answer it?
Yeah, I think so. Thanks.
So Max, it's Aaron here. I mean, in Wiscasset here, we have a traditional downtown, you know, like old brick buildings and, you know, bricks and mortar, you know, those mixed use buildings and things like that. But then we have the more commercial strip. You consider the downtown TIF, right? The old town, but then could you create a downtown TIF like on Route 1 the more commercial strip.
So Aaron, what I might do for you, and I'll send it to everyone else as well. The state does have its own checklist for what you would want to include in a downtown master plan / TIF district. And that might help answer your questions on what would be considered the downtown TIF or not.
All right, well, the only reason I say that is because in Wiscasset, we don't have a downtown master plan, but we actually have a
Right.
Bath Road master plan, and that's on that strip there, that commercial drag. So that's,
Okay.
it could be conceived as a downtown plan, but
All right, well, I'll send you those items, and if that plan does follow what the state's looking for in the downtown master plan to qualify for a downtown TIF, then I certainly don't mind talking with you a little bit more about it later.
thank you.
All right, any other questions? I'm gonna look at the chat to make sure no one typed something that didn't want to talk. Thanks, Max. All right,
I have another question. I was
yes,
looking at calculations for what benefits, the state aid, education benefit, but I think it was tax shifts.
sections.
And I'm just wondering how all of those are calculated.
Well, as I mentioned earlier, yeah, Jim, do you want to field that?
I think they're very situation specific.
They are, okay.
Cause I've got one here that we're looking at and then I've got two up in Sears Lawn, and they were very specific on funding and
I get, so can you give me an idea of what I guess it's included in the application?
yes.
What's the point of them? What are, like, why do you calculate them? What is the state looking for?
The tax shift?
Yeah,
Usually it's just to say how you came to the number or what you're anticipating to capture assessed value is. So if I have a $5 million project, but I'm saying that I'm only gonna generate $2 million worth of revenue. You know, how do I fund my $5 million project now? And I mentioned the captured assessed value. There's some projects that are limited based on your projected captured assessed value. Fire station, for example.
Mhm.
You're only allowed to have up to 15% of your captured assessed value or your estimated captured assessed value going towards such a project like that. So if you say that you have a $2 million fire station project, or $1 million fire station project, I'm not gonna get it with my math. If you're only gonna generate $2 million in revenue, you anticipate only $2 million in revenue for this, and you have a $1 million fire station project, well, you're not gonna have the full fire station covered with this. So that's why the tax shifts are being included. It's just so you have an idea, and so the residents as well have an idea just how much this TIF is actually gonna impact the community.
Yeah, the problem with projections is that they're really good the first year and they're worthless in the third year.
Oh, yeah,
and that's, so
There's no way around it, you just can't.
yeah, you don't know what your tax rate's gonna be, you don't know what the actual development's gonna be assessed at. and all that.
right.
But, so there was the calculating out the assessed value, or how much funding revenue you're gonna get in from the TIF.
Yep.
Like, I get that math, and there was another page that basically listed out the local education benefit, the county tax benefit, the state revenue sharing, and is that all? I mean, are those gonna be tied to how much? You know, if you look at your most recent tax bill that says, schools take this much, the county takes this much, is that what those are? Is that what that tax shift like spreadsheet is basically saying like, here's how much you are not, here's how much you didn't send to the county because of this, here's how much you didn't send to schools because of this?
Yeah. There's a specific document, your tax assessor has to fill out every, I think it's a local valuation or a report to the state on the valuation, what you have it as, right? And that includes how much would go to the school, how much would go to this, and how much would go to that. I believe that's the document.
Yeah, well, that was the original spreadsheet I did, projecting out, right, 90% TIF, 75 and so forth. And I projected out what the impact would have been to the local tax dollar in those particular scenarios. I think I had 4 scenarios that worked out, but it had to do with how much less the state, if we don't do the TIF, how much less, how much
Less subsidy.
we don't do the TIF, how much less subsidy do we have? That was the shift.
Okay,
And this is why I strongly encourage that if you are looking into a TIF, you talk with your tax assessor's agent. Because thank goodness Jim is here tonight to speak on
yeah,
that end of it, because we all might be great at math, but in the end, the tax assessor's agent is the one who ends up sending out those values and is the one who really can get a better estimate for how much we're looking at.
So case in point, did a revaluation, last year's mill rate was 20. There was a proposal at a 20 mill rate, this year's 13.90. So that whole proposal shot. Because the mill rate changed so much. But in order to have 100% valuation on the value of the TIF, you had to have 100% valuation on the rest of the town. And for 80% of the town, we have to do 80% on the TIF, and that changes the deal altogether. There's
but you can only,
better for a town to be at 100%
yeah,
in order when they're doing the TIF, way better, way better.
And that's actually something I probably should point out, and it's a shame that a couple people have already signed off. So one of the other things to keep in mind is, once you fully capture something, the more you decrease it, the less the state's gonna give any of that back. So some towns, I always encourage a town to create a 100% captured TIF district. Because if you don't like it, you can easily amend it and close out your TIF next year, no harm, no foul. But if a year goes by, or 2 years go by, and you say, oh, TIF actually sounds like a great idea, let's put that thing in TIF district, you've lost all that value, it's gone. Same thing, when you have a 100% capture of the full value. If you decide to say, well, we don't need all of it, we can put some of it back into the general fund. You could decide to have a 50% capture. But the state's not gonna allow you to go back up to 100%. You can keep going down the more you want, but the state's not going to allow you to go back up. So that's key things to keep in mind.
I think it's worth pointing out too, that you have the ability to make changes to the TIF over time as you
Yes,
come across new projects or whatever, as long as you get that approval of the town. And so,
Yes.
because I know the hangups is like, how are we gonna predict what we want to spend money on for 30 years? You can make some educated guesses and plans, but you can adjust those plans in 5 years or 8 years or 10 years or whatever.
there would certainly be a lot of towns that working on housing would be pretty ticked off if they learned that the TIF they've had for so long no longer can be extended for another 20 years. Yeah, they'd be pretty ticked at this point. Same thing with the eligible projects.
I think you said earlier, that if you're gonna amend a TIF, you gotta go back in the state.
Same process.
Yeah, okay.
And the town.
And
In the town, yeah.
Yep, same process.
I wasn't sure if maybe it was just the town and I was gonna.
No, gotta get it all approved through the same bodies.
Yeah,
Aaron, do you still have a question, or is that hand accidentally just up?
I'm sorry, I forgot to take that down.
No worries.
Well, I do have a question. Sorry.
No worries.
Would you, as an economic developer, would you propose creating a TIF as an incentive for bringing a business here? But like, I'm kind of, I don't understand why, from my standpoint, why you would even consider TIFs as an incentive, financial incentive necessarily for a business per se, because they still have to pay the taxes. It's really a benefit to the town. Mostly, unless you get that credit enhancement agreement.
Well, it could be the credit enhancement, but there are the other potential projects. So I'm gonna quickly get our slides back if I can to the eligible items, if I can remember which one it was. So we have projects that are outside of TIF that can support a TIF district. So maybe you have a housing with a lot of misspellings. I'm sorry about this, people. So maybe you have an individual who wants to build a hotel. That was an example someone gave. And it's just outside the sewer and water that service. and they say, we want to build this hotel, but we need to be on sewer and water. We need a credit enhancement so that we can afford the sewer extension. And you say, well, that's an option. Or if you're willing to not take the credit enhancement, you build your hotel, and we promise we will use that revenue from your property to extend the sewer and water out there. So you don't have to have a credit enhancement. You could select a parcel that is, as I said, very ideal for development. And if a developer says, well, I'd love to do it, but I need to do this or that, or I need to have this at my property or this at my property, you can use the TIF revenue in other ways to not do a credit enhancement if you want. I mentioned the parking earlier, and there was an individual who said, does this mean you can use it for buying the land so that a developer can just come in and not have that same land acquisition cost? That's an eligible use as well. It's not a credit enhancement, but it's still something that you have to make sure is passed and cleared by the town. So that's why there's a few options like that. So it is an incentive, but it's ideal that if a developer wants that, they are clear with you and the community very early on, because they come back 1 year after getting approval for all this and now seeking municipal funds. That's not really a good look. Trust me.
Would you consider offering it to them before they asked for it? In a sense that if you had an ulterior motive for using the revenues for another source, like i.e. a downtown TIF or something like that.
As I said, it really depends on what the goals of your community are. I can't really speak for that. If what you as a community want to do is get rid of a slum and blight or redevelop brownfield and say to yourselves, it's been empty or it's been like this for so long, we got to get rid of it. Then yeah, I think approaching the developer might be an idea if you know that this is a reputable individual or group that can do that. But if you're going to just play your hand like that very early on, I think everyone's going to start expecting that the only reason they want to go to the community is because they know they'll get some tax revenue back. And that doesn't go over well with the residents who don't get any kickbacks or tax incentives.
Yeah, I see your point. Thank you.
Yeah. So we are hitting the 90-minute mark. Are there any other questions? Online, in person?
One quick one. So this is, if I understand it in a simple way, it's shifting the tax from the general fund and putting it into this TIF to be used for projects or to fund, whatever the town approves. So it's the taxes aren't going anywhere. They're just kind of being shifted around for a different use.
Yes, but it's more of savings, because as I said, if you didn't do the TIF, all this revenue that we're talking about would be going off because you don't get as much money from the state.
Because you're capturing the real estate or the value at a certain date before it rises.
Correct.
So you're continuing to get the municipal revenue share.
Right.
That you got with the lower value.
You
continuing to get school aid that you got with the lower value.
And you don't get as high for county taxes. So what you don't have to spend on all that, you instead can put towards all these other projects. Which then can indirectly go towards anything really that you don't have to now spend from your general fund.
I like the term sheltering the revenue.
Yeah.
Because you're still getting it, but you're sort of protecting it from being, used in the calculations of your revenue sharing. So it's there and it's sort of protected from affecting your revenue sharing.
Right. All right. Well, as I said, if you haven't signed in, or if you are online and haven't put in the chat, please put the email. I will send documents after this. I want to thank everyone who came out tonight. The recording will be available later and sent out. Again, thank you.
Thank you, Matt.
Yeah, thanks, man.
Just make sure that I'm clear on it.